Good morning and welcome to Kernrope Mennonite Church. Though we're unable to gather in person, we are thankful that we're able to gather virtually to celebrate the first week of Advent. This year, our theme is Be Amazed. Each week, we'll be invited to notice the surprising and powerful ways in which God shows up, even when we least expect it. Today, we begin with a theme of hope in the fiery furnace. God is present with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. God doesn't offer an escape from suffering, but is right in the middle of it, walking in the flames beside them. Hope is not the absence of struggle. Hope is the trust that God's presence is always with us, even in the fire. Though we are online this week, we still celebrate the light of Advent through our virtual gathering and our own personal reflections on this coming of Jesus. We may not have our Advent wreath present with us this week, but I encourage you to imagine lighting our first candle, and week by week, we'll light another candle, shining more and more light, reminding us that God's presence is always with us, even when God feels hidden. As we wait for the fullness of Christmas, may this light call us to look up, look around, and be amazed at the God who comes close, bringing hope even in the fire. Please join me in our call to worship this morning. God of our ancestors, you are our one constant hope through all the ages. We come eager for stories of you standing among us. We come longing to feel your presence among your people once again. As the days darken around us, hope can feel a distant memory. Even in the middle of trials, we keep our eyes on you. Our allegiance is to you alone. Trust in God's steadfast love. Stand in amazement, ready to recognize God already among us here in this place. Our hope is in you, O God. Fill our hearts with the courage of our ancestors. Ready us to enter their story and be amazed. Please bow your head, or however you would choose to join me in our opening prayer. Ever-present God, we confess that the darkness can be frightening. On our own, we hesitate. Our hope flickers like a fragile flame. Yet you have gone before us. You were with the faithful in the fire. You have stood beside your people in the blaze. Strengthen us with the witness of those who have remained steadfast in the face of misused power. Give us the courage to trust you with our whole lives. Give us the boldness to step forward in faith, knowing that only in the deepest night can we see the blazing light of your power. Amen.
We will be singing Hope is a Candle, Voices Together, number 211, and this will be our theme song during Advent. Each week we'll be adding a different verse. is a candle once lit by the prophets, never consumed though it burns through the years. Dim in the daylight of power and privilege, when they are gone, hope will shine on. Hope is a candle once lit by the prophets, never consumed though it burns through the years. Dim in the daylight of power and privilege, when they are gone, hope will shine on.
The scripture reading for today is Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 to 30. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants." They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon.
Text for today comes to us from Daniel chapter 3, and we're told at the beginning of the story that King Nebuchadnezzar builds this giant, absurd statue. You know, one of the common critiques that modern day folks have about the Bible is that it's so old and antiquated, and because it's so old and antiquated, that it has like very little relevance to us in our modern life. And to that, I would say, like, well, thank God that modern day politicians aren't building giant golden statues with the hopes that their constituents would worship it, right? I love the story from Daniel. Like, it is so incredibly rich. And, like, on the one hand, like, it brings me a lot of comfort recognizing that politicians have been doing absurd sorts of things like this for centuries. And on the other hand, like it's kind of depressing recognizing that political figures have been doing absurd kinds of things like this for centuries, right? Like the fact that this situation is as old as human history is both comforting and really, really depressing, right? This kind of absurdity, both from antiquity and into like our present moment, I think requires us as followers of Jesus to be really discerning and ask a question of like, what does faithfulness in this moment look like? I think that this would have been a question that would have been central to the collective consciousness of the Jewish people as they found themselves living in Babylonian captivity, in the Babylonian exile. And I think that stories like today's from Daniel chapter 3 emerged as stories of encouragement and stories of an example of what faithfulness might look like in the midst of exile. So let's wrestle with this story a bit this morning. Our story opens up with all sorts of absurd details. And these absurd details point us to this idea that perhaps the story is like a satire or parody that's up there with like Saturday Night Live proportions, right? There's all sorts of absurd details in the story that, like, if we're paying attention to it, actually make this a really, really funny story. So the story begins, of course, with this retelling of this golden statue, right? And this golden statue, we're told, is 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide. Now, if we translate this into like modern measurements, what this tells us is that the statue was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. To put this in like some terms that we can work with, like to compare this to a local monument, landmark of like the statue of Mary on top of the Golden Dome. Mary's statue is 19 feet and weighs 4,000 pounds. So, like, the statue that Nebuchadnezzar has built is something like 4 times bigger than Mary on the Golden Dome at Notre Dame. Like, we're talking about like an absurd statue and probably like structurally impossible, right? I mean, this is almost like a giant golden pencil that, like, if a breeze came by, would knock it over, right? Like an absurd statue. But the absurd details don't just stop there, right? Like as the story unfolds, we continue to see absurd details mixed in with the story. The next absurd detail that we see is the list of all of the government officials that are called to the dedication of this statue. And it's not just the fact that they're called, but it's the fact that they get repeated twice. So we read, then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, and the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. In the very next line, we read, so the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces assembled for the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So again, it's not just the fact that like the story goes to great lengths to list out all of these government officials, but in the very next line, instead of saying, and then all of the government officials, no, it goes to great lengths to list them all out again. Again, this level of absurdity within the story pointing to like this group that King Nebuchadnezzar has surrounding him as he dedicates the statue. There's another level of absurdity in this story, and that's the music that prompts the worship of this statue. We read that you were commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, as soon as the people heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Again, just like the government officials, it's not just that the storyteller goes to great lengths to list out all of these musical instruments and the entire musical ensemble, but then does it twice within just another verse or two. The opening of the story is filled with all sorts of absurd details that are pointing to reality within Nebuchadnezzar's empire. And I think that for the storyteller, like they had to be absurd, they had to be like over the top because they had to be over the top, right? Like there was just a low grade level of absurdity that the people must have been living in, that there was this low grade level of absurdity that permeated the Babylonian culture as people tried to like deal with Nebuchadnezzar's ego in some way, right? And so like because there was this low grade like level of absurdity that they had to deal with, the author here in Daniel chapter 3 had to be like all the more absurd, pointing to all of these absurd details to draw actual attention to it because everybody would have just become kind of numb to it, right? See, the presence of all of these absurd details in the opening few lines of the story seems to suggest that perhaps we would be better off if we read the story in Daniel 3 as something like political commentary or political satire or political parody, rather than what we as modern people might think of as like quote unquote history. That there seems to be like a bit of an edge to the story, like calling attention to the absurdity of all of the pomp and circumstances that exist around King Nebuchadnezzar and the empire of Babylon. Now, we read next in the story that these Chaldeans seem to have it out for the Jewish people. We read that the Chaldeans said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, again listed out here, shall fall down and worship the golden statue. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." So we begin to see some parallels here between how the Chaldeans come to King Nebuchadnezzar. They begin their they begin by sharing their concerns to King Nebuchadnezzar by saying, "O king, live forever." Seems to be this, sort of royal greeting for the king. "O king, live forever. We acknowledge your title and we hope that, you live and rule and reign forever and ever. O king, live forever." But it's interesting to see sort of like a parallel response from Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when King Nebuchadnezzar calls them into his court. He calls them into this court, and he's basically like, "Is it true? Will you actually not bow down and worship the statue?" And their response begins by them saying, "O Nebuchadnezzar." The Chaldeans are, "O king, live forever." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are like, "O Nebuchadnezzar." And here I think we begin to get a glimpse of like what faithfulness might look like in this moment, right? It might look like a little bit of like just low-key civil disobedience and nonconformity, right? Like everybody else is willing to play the game of the empire to like, take care and deal with the emperor's ego, say, "Oh, king, live forever." And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are like, "Nah, we ain't playing that game. We'll just call you Nebuchadnezzar," right? Again, there's just these subtle details throughout pointing to like the political commentary of the story, and again pointing to like potentially what faithfulness might look like in this moment. So Nebuchadnezzar calls Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into his court, and he's like, "Is it true? Is it true? Will you actually not bow down and worship the statue?" And they respond by answering, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. If our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Some commentators have suggested that there's perhaps two different climaxes within this story. These definitive sort of turning points within this story. And if you're familiar with this story, perhaps you've heard it since your younger years in Sunday school, right? Like if you're familiar with this story, you might think of like the climactic moment being the fiery furnace, right? The fact that when King Nebuchadnezzar looks in this fiery furnace, he sees not three people, but a fourth. And that fourth one looks as if it is a god. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are saved by God in this fiery furnace. And then Nebuchadnezzar has this decree that nobody should blaspheme the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Most of us would think of this as like the climactic moment of the story. But again, some commentators have suggested that there's actually two different climaxes in this story. There's this climactic moment at the end, but then there's this moment right here that we just read. This moment when Nebuchadnezzar says, "Is it true? Will you not bow down and worship the statue?" And they say, "Oh, Nebuchadnezzar, we will not. No, we will not worship because we believe that our God has the ability to deliver us from this fiery furnace. And oh, by the way, even if God does not deliver us from this fiery furnace, we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue." That's a baller response to Nebuchadnezzar here, right? Like they just look him square in the face and they respond to his question of like, "Will you not bow down and worship?" And they say, No. See, this no for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego seems to come from this understanding that what Nebuchadnezzar is asking of them is nothing short of idolatry. And idolatry would have been a significant point of concern within the Jewish consciousness. The first two of the Ten Commandments point to this idea of idolatry. The first one being, you shall have no other gods before me, and the second one being, you shall not create for yourself an idol. But this issue of idolatry would have been particularly of high concern for the Jews living in exile because the prophets leading up to exile had warned them that if you continue down this path of idolatry, exile will be the reality. And so you can imagine now that they find themselves living in exile, living in Babylonian captivity, that there's this renewed commitment to resist idolatry. And so here we have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being this story of encouragement and an example to their fellow Jews living in exile of what faithfulness looks like in this present moment for them. See, this is a really, really rich and significant story in the context of exile, but also a really rich and significant story within this question that we began by asking of like, what does faithfulness in this present moment look like? And I think the answer that we get from this story is that faithfulness means like being hyper vigilant around idolatry. Because within the minds of the biblical authors, like idolatry is insidious. Idolatry is insidious because it starts small. It's just a crack in the facade. But if that crack isn't checked, it begins to grow and blossom into this point where like nation has co-opted God and the ways of God. I think it's helpful to recognize that within the theological imaginations of the biblical authors, like idolatry, something that happens primarily in one's mind. Idolatry is a misconception, a misunderstanding of who God is. It's a misconception, a misunderstanding of who God is and what God is about and what God desires for us and from us. See, idolatry isn't something that primarily begins in the heart, but it begins in the head. Having wrong thoughts and wrong assumptions about who God is, and wrong thoughts and wrong assumptions about what it is that God wants us to do. And see, Nebuchadnezzar's demands that the people bow down and worship this golden statue is, of course, idolatry because it links nation and worship together. It's idolatry because it begins to creep into the mind that perhaps God actually wants us to link God and nation together. And so you can imagine like the pushback that people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego might have gotten. Like, oh, well, to be a quote unquote good Jew means like being a good citizen, right? And perhaps we feel similar sorts of pushback in our own sort of context in the empire of the United States, that to be a quote unquote good Christian means to be a quote unquote good American, right? But the problem is that this can begin to blossom to the point where like we equate terms like Christian and American together, to the point that we can't ever separate these two. And we find ourselves in situations where like being a quote unquote good American actually requires us to be a quote unquote bad Christian. One commentator notes that to make God and country equally important makes it possible to follow the demands of the state, even when those demands contradict the will and way of God. Idolatry is insidious, even when it pertains to the idolatry of one's nation. It starts small, it's just a crack in the foundation, but then it blossoms into this point where one's nation co-opts God and the ways of God. And so, if idolatry is insidious, then what does faithfulness in this moment look like? I think faithfulness in this moment might look like echoing the words of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, of seeing them as a story of encouragement and an example for us to say, like, we will not serve your gods, and we will not worship the golden statue. So if we take their words and translate it into our context, perhaps faithfulness looks like saying, we will not serve white Christian nationalism. We will not bow down and worship nation or flag or political leaders or this military industrial complex that has hijacked so much of the American conscience. This Advent season, I wonder if faithfulness looks like turning from all of this idolatry and turning and serving and worshiping and if it looks like turning with all of our hearts and our minds and worship and service to the true King, not the Nebuchadnezzars of this world, but the true King. The King who showed up not with like power and might and a golden statue, but who showed up in vulnerability and humility, who showed up not demanding worship, but instead showed up with a life dedicated to serving others, who showed up and whose first sermon proclaimed this radical jubilee of God and this inbreaking of God's shalom for all people. This first Sunday of Advent has this traditional focus of hope. Hope that another world is possible. I don't know about you, but I have a profound hope that another world is possible, and I hope that another world is indeed possible. But I think for us to see that other world be possible, that it might require some radical courage and radical bravery from you and me and we and us to say, we will not serve your gods and we will not worship the golden statue. And to that we say, may it be so among us. Amen.
Now hear these words of benediction. Go now with courage, trusting in the God who walks with you through the fire. May the light of God's salvation shine brightly for you even in the darkest days. Hold fast to hope, for the Lord is faithful and will never forsake you. Go in peace, ready to be amazed by the one who acts to save.